Have you ever felt like you're living in one world, but maybe the rules of another keep intruding? Or, wondered why certain communities seem to operate on a completely different wavelength from the broader society,
Huh.
almost like they're following a different rule book altogether. Today on the Deep Dive, our mission is to unpack a really fascinating and maybe challenging perspective on American society. It's presented in a thought-provoking document called the Occupier Thesis.
It's quite a title.
It is. And at its core, this thesis proposes a pretty radical, almost jarring idea that for some communities inside the United States, the U.S. government operates less like a unifying national authority.
And more like an occupying force.
Yeah, exactly,
Right.
an occupying force. It's a concept that, well, it might sound surprising to many, but the author, Chris Abraham, argues it's deeply rooted in the lived experience of specific groups and subcultures. So what does this actually mean for the fabric of America? We're going to dive deep into how this occupier lens might help us understand America's internal conflicts. We'll be looking at concepts like enclaves, autonomy, and what the author really powerfully labels parallel realities.
And what's really fascinating here, I think, is that this isn't presented as just a theoretical metaphor, or some dry academic exercise. The thesis contends that it's a profoundly lived, day-to-day reality for specific subcultures across the country. It gives us a kind of critical framework, maybe a new vocabulary, to understand those deep-seated tensions you might see in communities.
Right, the ones you feel but can't quite name.
Exactly. Tensions that often feel palpable, but you might struggle to precisely define or articulate them. It offers a language to describe a very real, and often, let's face it, emotionally charged sociological phenomenon. It lets us move beyond just saying there's conflict to maybe understanding its foundational roots.
And it's this document, the Occupier Thesis, by Chris Abraham, that's guiding our exploration today. It's a really thought-provoking analysis, digging into the intricate dynamics of internal conflict within the U.S. So our goal in this deep dive is to pull out the core insights from this document, helping you, our listener, understand this powerful perspective deeply without getting tangled up in academic jargon or, preconceived notions.
Yeah, to get to the heart of the argument itself.
Exactly. We'll explore why some communities might see federal or state authority this way and what the implications of that perception are for the fabric of the nation. And it's crucial, I think, as we start to remember our role here. We're aiming to explain the ideas presented in the source material. We're not endorsing them.
No, absolutely. Understanding isn't endorsement.
Right. We're here to understand this viewpoint and its many implications so you can gain a fuller, maybe more nuanced picture of the complex issues playing out in our society today. Okay, so to really unpack the heart of this thesis, we need to grapple with its most surprising, maybe its most challenging assertion, that for certain communities, the U.S. government is viewed as an occupier.
It lands hard, that word.
It does. And according to the author, this isn't just empty rhetoric. Far from it. It's argued to be deeply rooted in the lived experience within specific subcultures, places where a distinct, sometimes very old, set of morals, rules, and norms hold sway. Imagine growing up where the rules you learned from your family, your neighbors, your community leaders were maybe totally different from what you saw in the news or heard from, say, the police or government officials.
It's like living in a self-contained world.
Yeah, a micro-society with its own sort of gravitational pull.
That's precisely it. The author emphasizes that while to an outsider, these might just look like, neighborhoods.
To geography.
Right. But to those living inside them, they are profoundly perceived as autonomous zones. These aren't just physical areas, they're cultural and moral territories. And within these zones, residents actively cultivate and live by their own ingrained ideas of dignity, justice, respect values that often differ, sometimes significantly, from the external mainstream norms governing the wider society.
So it creates this powerful sense of a distinct world.
A distinct, self-contained world, yeah. A really deep difference in perception that doesn't just shape daily life, it fundamentally changes how people in these enclaves interact with the world outside their borders. It's this foundational difference in what's seen as right or just that really shakes everything.
And what's really striking is how the document highlights the incredible diversity of these places, these enclaves.
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about just one type of community here or one specific demographic. The thesis deliberately casts a wide net. It mentions whether it's a Black inner-city neighborhood, a Latino enclave, an Orthodox Jewish suburb, a Mormon town, a Chinatown, or even a rural Appalachian community.
It covers a lot of ground.
It really does.
Yeah.
So this isn't just about race or ethnicity or even just money. It's about any group that's developed a strong, internally cohesive culture, maybe a shared history, and a distinct set of rules and values that mark them as different from the prevailing external norms.
Yeah, any of these communities, despite being so different from each other, can embody this occupier dynamic, according to the thesis. And the analysis, when you get into it, shows how these communities aren't just diverse in who lives there, but also in the really intricate ways they internally define things like justice and dignity.
How so?
Well, imagine a community where, say, disputes are settled not in formal courts, but by respected elders or maybe religious figures, where breaking rules is met with community sanctions, not necessarily legal penalties from the outside.
Okay.
So when you have a community that holds its own concepts of right and wrong, fair and respectful, its own internal logic, its own dimension A, as the thesis calls it, and then an external system, dimension B, tries to impose its definitions, well, that's where the real friction starts.
It's not just disagreeing on a law.
No, it's deeper. It's a fundamental clash of deeply ingrained moral frameworks, a conflict of competing ideas about who has legitimate authority. This internal framing is absolutely critical to understanding the kind of deep-seated conflicts that can bubble up.
Okay, so this tension, this clash of authorities, it needs a framework to really understand it. And this is where the thesis introduces this really illuminating idea, asking us to picture these parallel realities coexisting.
The dimension A and dimension B concept.
Exactly. Dimension A and dimension B. And this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because it helps grasp how these separate realities can occupy the same physical space. So dimension A is defined as the internal logic, the enclave. And this isn't just a vague feeling, right? It covers its local rules, local customs, and local enforcement.
The unwritten rules sometimes.
Yeah, or sometimes written. The code of conduct that governs daily life, social interactions, maybe even how arguments get settled within that specific community.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the operating system running inside the community's walls.
Yeah.
And then existing right alongside it is dimension B,
The external authority.
right? The overarching authority, the official system, represented by the federal, state, or municipal government. This is the formal legal structure, the administration, that on paper governs everyone within the U.S. borders, operates through courts, police, bureaucracies.
And what's fascinating and really powerful about this framework is how these two dimensions, A and B, are described as coexisting on the same map but operating on separate moral planes.
Separate moral planes.
Yeah, and that creates this fundamental disconnect, this constant state of potential friction. They might share the same physical streets, use the same public transport, but the underlying moral and legal frameworks people are actually operating by, the ones they see as legitimate, they're fundamentally different.
It's like trying to run two different operating systems on the same computer without them being compatible.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. Think about it, maybe a local community values group harmony over individual rights in certain disputes, but the external legal system, dimension B, prioritizes strict adherence to written laws, regardless of the social fallout.
Okay.
So an action taken by one side, when seen through the lens of the other, can seem totally illogical, unjust, maybe even hostile.
The source gives a really vivid example for this, Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
It describes D.C. as having always been two cities at once. On one side, you've got Chocolate City, the historic African-American community, its own vibrant culture, internal social structures, distinct history.
Right.
And on the other side, there's the white-collar, wispy-influenced, policy-driven D.C. of think tanks and bureaucracy, a world built on federal power, institutional norms.
Very different worlds.
Totally. And the thesis points out, both worlds use the same streets but live by different codes. You can literally walk a few blocks, and even if the buildings look the same, you can often feel that cultural shift. The unspoken rules change. The priorities feel subtly but fundamentally different. It's like a small-scale version of the national dynamic the thesis is exploring.
And the implications of these separate moral planes, they're really profound. This duality makes real mutual understanding or even just smooth governance inherently difficult, because the very definitions of order, justice, even what counts as a crime can differ so dramatically.
So what's okay in dimension A might be illegal in dimension B.
Exactly, or vice versa. What dimension A sees as a legitimate, maybe necessary act could be a serious offense according to dimension B. Think about, say, an internal community justice system using restitution or restorative justice for something, a solution that brings the community back into balance. But then dimension B steps in and applies a punitive jail sentence. That doesn't just override the internal solution. From the community's perspective, it can feel like an alien, harsh, fundamentally unjust intervention.
It's more than just a communication breakdown.
Oh, much more. It's a foundational difference in how realities is perceived, how governance gets its legitimacy, and how justice is actually done. This idea of coexisting but separate realities. It's powerful. And to really get its weight, the author uses this compelling analogy. It takes the theory into a stark, real-world context.
Right, that's the next piece. To really illustrate this deep disconnect, the thesis makes this really striking, maybe even provocative comparison to a post-war zone, specifically Baghdad after Saddam Hussein fell.
It's a bold analogy.
It is. It definitely grabbed your attention because it completely reframes how we usually think about domestic governance in the U.S. So the author details this comparison by talking about a friend's experience over there in Baghdad. After Saddam's regime collapsed, the city didn't just snap back into being a unified place.
No, far from it.
Instead, Baghdad apparently quickly broke down into this patchwork of warlords, each controlling their own territory. Could be neighborhoods, could be whole districts.
Right. And these warlords, they govern their zones with their own rules, their own informal justice systems, their own ways of keeping order.
And then, crucially, the U.S. forces arrived, representing an entirely separate layer of authority. So you get this picture of multiple overlapping but fundamentally distinct systems of control, all operating at the same time in the same city.
And the thesis really hammers this point. The two realities rarely interacted unless they collided violently. That's absolutely key to understanding the power of this analogy.
They just ignored each other mostly?
Largely, yeah. The U.S. forces had their rules of engagement, their objectives. The local warlords were immersed in their own power structures, their own priorities. They coexisted until something forced a clash. And the most potent part of this analogy, according to the text, is what happened when U.S. troops did act against a warlord. The locals often saw it as an inhumane breach of their autonomy. They'd say, this isn't your business.
Even if the warlord was, objectively bad.
From their perspective, yeah. An external foreign force was interfering with their internal governance, regardless of how the U.S. viewed the warlord's actions. It was seen as imposing an alien justice system onto a space that considered itself self-governing.
Okay, so here's the core connection for our discussion. The direct parallel drawn to America. The thesis states flatly, the same sentiment arises in America when federal or state authorities pierce the internal order of an enclave.
It's not about literal warlords here.
No, definitely not in most cases. But it's about that same profound feeling of an outside authority, dimension B, intruding on an established internal order, dimension A.
So what does piercing the internal order look like here domestically?
Well, it could be a big federal drug bust in a neighborhood where maybe informal codes have long dictated how certain activities, even illegal ones, are managed. Maybe there's a fragile peace kept by local figures.
Or ICE raids.
Exactly. ICE raids in a community that's declared itself a sanctuary, actively resisting federal immigration enforcement. Basically, any action that, from the enclave's perspective, violates its self-determined rules and challenges its sense of rightful autonomy, its internal sovereignty. It's a clash of perceived jurisdictions, and it sparks, well, deep resentment and a sense of violation.
And the analysis here really digs into the emotional and cultural impact of this perceived breach of autonomy. When an external authority, Dimension B, steps into a space where Dimension A is understood to govern, it's almost never seen as just law enforcement or protection by the people living there.
How is it seen then?
As an invasion, an act of deep disrespect, a fundamental challenge to their sense of self-governance. Imagine a community that prides itself on handling its own problems, prefers local solutions.
Oh, yeah.
When an external police force comes in and arrests someone for something the community might tolerate or handle internally, that act isn't seen as crime prevention. It's often interpreted as an assertion of alien power, a deliberate dismissal of their internal norms.
Which reinforces the occupier idea.
Absolutely. It deeply solidifies that narrative. It transforms what Dimension B sees as routine police work into an act of colonial intrusion, an illegitimate use of force from Dimension A's viewpoint. It becomes a clash of fundamental rights and perceived sovereignties, a collision of worlds.
And if we extrapolate from that a bit, this Baghdad parallel gives us a powerful lens for looking at current events, even when there's no literal violence involved.
Right.
Think about a community with a thriving informal economy, maybe certain goods, certain services operating with its own internal rules of the game. Who sells where, how disputes get handled, maintaining a fragile, unofficial kind of peace.
Okay.
Then a federal agency, maybe the IRS or the health department, steps in to impose its regulations. From the enclave's perspective, it's not just disrupting an illegal market or an informal service. It's an external power imposing its morality and breaking an established, even if informal, local order.
Seen as destabilizing, not enforcing.
It's exactly destabilizing. And this dynamic could play out in other areas too, right? Like education federal mandates on curriculum might be seen as undermining local, culturally specific priorities. Or public health, top-down vaccination campaigns could clash with community beliefs. The common thread is always that perceived violation of a self-determined sphere. So, okay, what does this all mean for daily life? Especially when it comes to law enforcement. The thesis makes a very clear, very critical connection here. It spells out how the occupier idea totally reframes those interactions.
It does. It states very directly that whenever federal agents, state troopers, or IC officers enter these autonomous spaces, they're seen as outsiders, colonizers.
Colonizers, that's a really potent word choice.
It is. And it immediately shifts the whole frame. What might look like straightforward policing becomes an act of foreign imposition.
The source then digs into the meaning behind some powerful slogans we hear, like all cops are bastards or snitches get stitches. The thesis argues these aren't just, generalized anti-police feelings born out of simple anger. No, it says they're much more specific and strategic. They are warnings to maintain the walls between worlds.
Maintaining the walls?
Yeah, explicitly aimed at keeping Dimension B from imposing its laws on Dimension A. So they're not just expressions of anger, they're effectively internal rules, codes of conduct designed to protect the enclave's internal order from outside interference.
So snitches get stitches isn't just about not reporting crime.
According to this view, no. It's about preventing collaboration with the perceived occupier. It's about reinforcing loyalty and sticking to the internal system.
And this perception, this deep-seated feeling, it also explains why that common trope in movies, white officers entering Native American reservations always feels so charged, so loaded with history and tension.
Because the reservation has its own laws.
In many ways, yes, its own police, its own inherent sense of sovereignty, even within the broader U.S. legal system. So when outside law enforcement comes in, especially uninvited, it's immediately felt as an encroachment on that self-governance, a violation of sovereign space. The thesis argues the same dynamic plays out in these other diverse enclaves across America. And if we dive deeper into this analysis of maintaining the walls, these slogans, these community norms, they function as a really powerful, even if informal, type of self-governance and resistance against that perceived external authority.
How so?
They create immense social pressure, a kind of collective agreement to uphold Dimension A's rules and actively resist Dimension B imposing its authority. This social contract isn't usually written down, but it's deeply understood, and it's enforced through community expectations, maybe social ostracization, or sometimes even harsher internal penalties for those who break it.
Like being called a snitch.
Exactly. When someone gets labeled a snitch, in this context, they're not just betraying one person. They're seen as undermining the community's autonomy itself, collaborating with an external force that wants to invalidate their internal way of life. It's a complex, self-reinforcing system, really, designed to protect the enclave's unique cultural and, you could say, legal autonomy.
If we think about the long-term consequences for society, it's pretty significant, isn't it? When a large part of the population sees law enforcement not as protectors, not as partners, but fundamentally as a colonial force.
It profoundly erodes trust. Cooperation becomes almost impossible. It creates this enduring adversarial relationship instead of a partnership.
Which makes dealing with crime or any social issue within these communities incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. Because any intervention from Dimension B is automatically met with deep suspicion, maybe active resistance. It's seen as intrusion, not help or legitimate governance. It just becomes this constant grinding tension point that can flare up into open conflict really easily, creating this persistent sense of unrest, instability within the whole country.
Okay, moving on. It's crucial to see that this idea of internal self-governance isn't just history or abstract theory. The thesis points out how this deep desire for autonomy has shown up in very public, very contemporary ways recently.
Bringing it right into the present day.
Exactly. It demonstrates its ongoing relevance. The source gives concrete examples mentioned in the document showing this logic playing out in real time. It specifically references things like CHAZ in Seattle. You remember the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone that popped up for a while, where activists basically declared an area free from state control, or sanctuary cities across the country. The thesis argues these aren't just isolated incidents or brief protests. They are powerful, explicit examples of this deep-seated desire for self-governance within distinct communities, actively carving out spaces where Dimension A rules consciously defy Dimension B.
And the underlying belief here, as the author clarifies it, is that these movements are really rooted in the conviction that enclaves should police themselves. It's not just a preference, it's a deeply held belief, almost sacred, that their internal systems, their norms, are legitimate and sufficient.
And therefore, external intervention is.
Inherently illegitimate. An affront. Think about sanctuary policies. They're not just about protecting undocumented immigrants, although that's part of it. They are a direct assertion of local Dimension A authority over federal Dimension B immigration laws.
And the source specifically highlights sanctuary policies, saying they operate like de facto reservations areas where the federal government's rules are selectively ignored in favor of local norms.
That's a really powerful comparison.
It is. It draws this direct, intentional line between the historical idea of a sovereign Native American reservation and modern city policies. It frames these places not just as having different rules, but as actively carving out their own spheres of sovereignty, their own pockets of self-governance within the larger national structure. It's like a declaration of local self-determination.
And the in-depth analysis boils it down. The logic is simple. We govern ourselves. That's the core, unshakable principle driving these things. It's not just about pushing back against external police reactively. This mindset goes way beyond just law and order.
How so?
It profoundly shapes identity. It fosters this intense sense of pride in the community's ability to manage its own affairs, provide for its own people, and, crucially, it strengthens the collective resistance to external authority. When a community can truly say, we govern ourselves, it's not just stating a fact, it's a powerful declaration of cultural, social, political self-determination. A testament to their autonomy despite external pressures. This belief is vital for Dimension A to keep existing.
And this whole phenomenon, it isn't static, right? It's not just confined to communities that have been around forever or based on old history. The thesis points out it's actually expanding. New demographics coming into the country are part of this dynamic.
Which is a really important aspect, yeah. The evolving social landscape.
The thesis notes the dynamic nature, stating clearly this concept of autonomous zones isn't limited to long-established communities. Quite the opposite, it's expanding with waves of migration and refugee settlement.
So the map of these enclaves is constantly changing.
Exactly. It reflects shifting demographics, global movements of people coming to the U.S. As new communities form, they often bring distinct cultural norms, social structures, which then have to interact with the existing national framework. And to illustrate this, the source lists diverse new enclaves that have emerged. Syrian, Afghani, Saudi, Kuwaiti, Persian, and Somali communities have established their own tight-knit networks. It even specifically mentions Somali populations in some states operating with a remarkable level of autonomy.
Setting up their own informal courts, ways to resolve disputes, social support systems.
Yeah, things that run parallel to or maybe even replace existing state and federal structures. It's a striking observation about the ongoing organic creation of these internally governed spaces.
And conceptually, this isn't entirely new, is it? These newer communities, much like the long-established Latino enclaves in LA or the Mexican-American districts in the Southwest, they often quickly develop their own informal codes, just like the older ones did.
It's a natural evolution.
Seems like it. For immigrant and refugee groups trying to preserve their culture, maintain social cohesion, establish order within their own group, especially when facing an unfamiliar external system that might not fully understand or meet their specific needs, this kind of community bonding is often a response to feeling vulnerable and a desire for cultural continuity.
And the source details these informal codes pretty explicitly. It points out the prevalence of FBU, for us, I guess, policing,
FUU.
distrust of outside enforcement, and the same snitches get stitches mentality that keeps Dimension B at bay. So it's a clear continuation of the same strategy we talked about earlier. It shows these principles of self-governance and resistance aren't unique to one type of enclave. They're a recurring response, used by newer communities too, to maintain their internal coherence and resist perceived external authority.
It really underscores how pervasive this two-dimensional reality is, according to the thesis. And the analysis explores exactly how cultural identity and a perceived external threat fuel the rapid formation of these self-governing spaces. When people share a strong cultural background, a language, often a history of collective experience.
And they see the mainstream authority as maybe hostile or indifferent.
We're just not equipped to understand their internal norms, right? They naturally band together. They create their own parallel systems for governance, for social support. And that few be you mentality for us, by us, reinforces this internal logic. It prioritizes community loyalty, self-sufficiency, over following external rules or cooperating with outside institutions.
It's like a self-preservation
Yeah, it's a
mechanism.
powerful one.
Hmm.
Yeah. A way to build resilience and autonomy in what's often a new and challenging environment.
Now, beyond the formal policies or explicit resistance, the thesis also points to more subtle cultural spaces where this two dimensions idea plays out, sometimes without anyone saying a word. It's about the unspoken rules of engagement in daily life.
The less obvious boundaries.
Exactly. The source gives vivid examples of these less formal, but maybe equally significant, cultural boundaries. It mentions places like go-go music clubs in D.C., that specific musical genre and cultural scene deeply rooted in certain D.C. neighborhoods, or tightly bonded neighborhoods in Philly or Baltimore. These aren't explicitly called autonomous zones like a sanctuary city is, but they function in a really similar way. They're spaces where a distinct internal culture dictates how people interact, what's expected, who belongs.
And in these cultural spaces, the author explains, there's often an unspoken rule of separation, a palpable boundary that people inside Dimension A understand. Outsiders might be tolerated, maybe they visit or pass through, but they are never truly part of the dimension.
An invisible barrier.
Yeah, almost. A palpable sense that while you're physically in their space, you don't fully belong. You don't intrinsically get its workings, its history, its unique social fabric. You're observing, maybe enjoying, but you're not operating on the Dimension A logic, that shared understanding binding the community. It's a subtle but powerful way of reinforcing the internal us versus the external them.
And the analysis of this is fascinating. How do these subtle cultural boundaries actually reinforce Dimension A and the perception of Dimension B as outside?
Well, it's through shared experience, shared history, often shared struggles, that these bonds get forged and reinforced. When these cultural spaces become exclusive, whether consciously or not, they naturally strengthen the idea that there's an us and a them, a unique internal world separate from the external one.
And the implications for social cohesion.
They're profound. If significant cultural spaces operate with this unspoken rule of separation, it really limits genuine integration, empathy, mutual understanding across different dimensions. It could potentially create deeper, more entrenched divisions in society over time. It makes achieving real national unity a much harder goal.
So this deep-seated sense of ownership, this distinct governance, it naturally leads to what the author calls a warlord mentality, which is, again, a really striking phrase.
It is, but it's important to remember the clarification.
Right, even if it's not violent in the traditional sense. That's a crucial distinction to get the nuanced meaning. So what emerges, according to the thesis, is this warlord mentality. Again, vital to clarify. Not necessarily violent, but deeply territorial. It's not about armed conflict usually, but about a profound psychological, social, often political claim to a specific space and the people in it. The core of this mentality is described as clear and unyielding. Each enclave believes it owns its turf and resents outside interference. It's not just preferring local control. It's a deep conviction that this is their space, their people, and any intrusion from Dimension B is a violation of that inherent ownership, that legitimate self-governance. It's a constant assertion of internal sovereignty.
Which directly explains why national policing or any external government authority is so often seen not as protection, but as occupation.
Because from Dimension A's view,
Dimension B isn't upholding a shared law and order. It's not protecting the community. It's actively intruding, imposing alien rules, undermining the legitimacy of internal systems. There's this fundamental difference in perception that makes reconciliation incredibly hard.
one side sees legitimate enforcement.
While the other sees an invasion of their rightful territory and autonomy. This disagreement is exactly what fuels ongoing conflict. Because the very same action, viewed through these two different lenses, gets interpreted in completely opposite ways.
And if we think about how this warlord mentality might show up in non-violent ways, it broadens our understanding of its impact, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It could be expressed through intense political organizing within a community, to resist state or federal policies, maybe redirecting resources inward to strengthen Dimension A's own structures.
Or activism.
Yeah, community activism aimed at getting funding for internal self-run programs, education, healthcare, instead of engaging with external mainstream ones. Or it could just be a cultural withdrawal, communities choosing to rely solely on their own internal systems for support, for resolving conflicts, even for education, rather than engaging with broader societal structures.
It's a kind of internal self-determination.
A quiet assertion of sovereignty, yeah, one that often goes unnoticed or is deeply misunderstood by outsiders.
Which brings us to a head.
Hmm?
This also explains why defiance against police or any external authority is so often framed from inside the enclave as righteous resistance.
That's a critical moral distinction in the thesis, essential for understanding the motivations behind these clashes.
The core idea here is that, from the enclave's perspective, when defiance happens, it's the warlord defending his turf against the occupier.
It reframes the whole narrative.
Completely. It transforms an act that Dimension B might label as crime, disorder, maybe even treason, into an act of profound self-defense, moral righteousness, courageous self-preservation from Dimension A's viewpoint.
And this moral framing is crucial for grasping the depth of the conflict. It elevates acts of defiance against external authority into acts of justice or self-preservation within the enclave's own moral framework. It's not about breaking the law just because. It's about upholding a perceived higher internal law, protecting the community's dignity, autonomy, identity against what feels like an illegitimate intrusion.
So it legitimizes resistance within the community.
It does. It can turn those who defy external authority into heroes, maybe martyrs, defenders of their people. It creates this powerful internal narrative that reinforces the divide. And the challenges for conventional governance then become just enormous when significant parts of the population see their actions as righteous resistance against an occupier.
How do you govern effectively then?
Exactly. How do you enforce laws, maintain order, even provide public services when the very legitimacy of your authority is rejected at such a foundational level? A standard law enforcement approach, just applying universal rules, will often only reinforce the occupier narrative and deepen the divide. It creates a cycle of resentment, resistance.
It demands a rethink.
It seems to, a profound reevaluation of how engagement happens. Maybe even asking what governance really means in a landscape full of these perceived internal sovereignties. It shifts the whole paradigm for how we might approach societal challenges and conflicts in America.
So what does this all mean for the bigger picture of America? The thesis offers a really powerful, maybe stark conclusion. It challenges our usual notion of national unity. Ultimately, what the Occupier thesis suggests is that America isn't one singular country in the way we often think of it, this monolithic entity under one accepted authority. Instead, it posits it's many cultures layered on a single map.
A complex mosaic.
Yeah, but one where the pieces don't necessarily fit smoothly under one single authority. They exist in distinct, often resistant layers. And this reiterates the core conflict we've been talking about. Each believes in its own right to govern itself, and each sees outside enforcement as colonial intrusion. This isn't just a political disagreement about policy, it's a deep cultural, philosophical divide about who really has the legitimate authority to make and enforce rules, and whose laws truly apply where, a clash of fundamental sovereignty.
And this really just reinforces the differing views we've discussed all along. The federal and state governments, Dimension B, they unequivocally see themselves as the ultimate legitimate authority. They believe they have the inherent right to govern everywhere within their borders.
But the enclaves?
But the enclaves, as the thesis makes so clear, fundamentally see them as occupiers, as external forces imposing an alien rule, often perceived as unjust or irrelevant to their internal order. It's a complete flip in perspective, a real cognitive dissonance in how governance is experienced and seen.
So the key takeaway, the synthesis from all this, is pretty clear and, frankly, quite sobering.
Yeah.
As long as these dimensions coexist without reconciliation, every encounter between them will feel like a clash between colonizer and colonized. It suggests these aren't just isolated incidents or unfortunate misunderstandings. They're fundamental examples of a systemic, foundational conflict that will just keep playing out, sometimes violently, until these deeply different views of authority can somehow be acknowledged, understood, and maybe reconciled. It paints a picture of ongoing inherent tension.
And this highlights exactly why that cry of occupation resonates so deeply in these communities, and why the concept of autonomy remains the unspoken, often unacknowledged heart of America's cultural conflict. It's not just wanting local control or preferring different rules. It's a profound assertion of self-determination, self-preservation against what's perceived as an intrusive external power. Understanding this foundational tension is absolutely vital for anyone trying to make sense of the complex social and political dynamics in the U.S. today. It lets us move beyond superficial takes to the deeply rooted realities.
So thinking about all this, what stands out to you from this deep dive into the occupier thesis? As you go about your day, maybe in your own city or community, your own neighborhood even,
Yeah.
how might this two dimensions, one map idea change how you see interactions between different groups? Or even how you understand local news stories, especially ones involving police or community protests? What does it really mean for having a shared national identity when different groups inside that nation see the same authority figure so profoundly differently?
And that raises a really important, maybe uncomfortable question for all of us, doesn't it? If these dimensions truly operate on such separate moral planes, what kind of bridges, if any, can realistically be built between them? And how might understanding this foundational tension, acknowledging these deeply held but different claims of legitimate authority, change how we approach societal challenges? Maybe moving beyond just traditional enforcement models to something that fosters genuine understanding, if not maybe outright unity, in a nation so clearly made up of many cultures layered on a single map. It's a complex puzzle, for sure, but one undoubtedly worth thinking about.